Hello, this is David from DN Cognitive Counseling. Last night I spoke a lot about the white fragility, and I got through the entire first page with going through a number of the problems and fallacies that the book draws on from its very inception. Tonight I'm going to continue on the second page. But before I do that, I want to address one issue that Jen brings up. When speaking about the idea of what the United States was founded on, it was founded based upon an ideal. Now, the founders did not live up to that ideal. They did not, from the inception, have the power or the capacity to make the ideal actually true. And there also wasn't the will of the people at that time for that ideology to come to fruition. But the only reason where we are today is because of that ideal. In fact, our ideal spread to France, which led to their revolution, and the way that a lot of people around the world now see the ideas of freedom. And that's what people don't really understand. Because prior to the United States, countries and its formations were much more rigid in structure, and they weren't around this idealism. They were around power. They were around generally kingships. And basically people's rights were trampled over all over the place in the aspect of power. The United States was a beacon of hope for a change in ideology. And the founders themselves doubted whether or not this experiment would actually ever be able to be fulfilled. The sad part is, most of us today don't learn history. And the little bit that we do learn is actually a misrepresentation of actual facts. What will be looked at is all the negatives, every single aspect of every wrong and sin to beat the country over the head with, without also looking at all the positives and all the amazing things that were done. And I think that's one of the flaws of the entire mindset of the book, White Fragility. It doesn't take a look at reality in a balanced approach. It has an agenda with its mindset from the start, and it draws its conclusion from that ideology. And anytime you start off that way, you're going to have problems. It's like somebody that believes that Jesus is God, a Christian, and says to you, well, why don't you believe so? Because the premise of the argument is my belief is already correct, without the idea of questioning, how did I get to that belief to begin with? And questioning whether there is the validity to that belief first. So before we get to why I don't believe in something, the first question is, why do I believe in something? And again, this book not only doesn't do that, it misrepresents history in horrific ways, and hopefully I'll be able to illustrate some of those points. So again, to Jen's point, I do agree that America has not lived up to the ideals, but it did have an ideal that has led to tremendous progress in history. Again, second page of the author's note. Second page, all progress. All progress we have made in the realm of civil rights has been accomplished through identity politics. Women's suffrage, the Americans with Disability Act, Title IX, federal recognition of same-sex marriage. A key issue in the 2016 presidential election was the white working class. They're all manifestations of identity politics. So, her statement is that we only make progress in the realm because of identity politics, which would denote that a person has to be a part of that identity in order to help make progress. I don't think, not only is that not historically true, it's also a lack of understanding of both the women's movement as well as even the civil rights movement. So I want to just illustrate this by just going to Wikipedia, which is pretty sad that I have to go to Wikipedia. This is the Abolitionist Movement in the United States. As you see, abolitionism of the anti-slavery movement in the United States was a movement which sought to end slavery in the United States, immediately active both before and during the American Civil War. in the Americas and Western Europe. Abolitionism was a movement which sought to end the Atlantic slave trade and set slaves free. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers condemned slavery on humanistic grounds, and English Quakers and some evangelical denominations condemned slavery as unchristian. Now again, according to Ms. DiAngelo, the only reason for this would be identity politics. But if you read here, neither of these ideas have anything to do with identity politics. It has to do with the idea of a humanistic ideology of what we believe that we should treat people and how we should treat them. Or we believed in the idea that because human beings were made in the image of God, and therefore human beings were put into slavery, therefore it was wrong and unchristian at the time. Neither an identity politic. At the same time, most slaves were Africans, but thousands of Native Americans were also enslaved. In the 18th century, as many as 6 million Africans were transported to the United States as slaves, and at least 1/3 of them on British ships to North America. The colony of Georgia originally prohibited slavery. Between 1780 and 1804, all northern states, beginning with the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery from Pennsylvania in 1780, passed legislation abolishing slavery, sometimes by gradual emancipation. Massachusetts ratified a constitution then declared all men equal. Freedom suits challenging slavery based on the principles brought an end to slavery in the state of Virginia. Similar declarations of rights were interpreted by the courts and not applicable to African or African Americans. All the states banned the international slave trade by 1790. South Carolina did so in 1787, but in 1803 reversed itself. During the ensuing decades, the Abolitionist Movement grew in the northern states, and Congress regulated the expansion of slavery as new states were admitted to the Union. The United States federal government criminalized the international slave trade in 1808 and made slavery unconstitutional in 1865 as a result of the American Civil War. So, as you saw, and as you could read, the fact and the idea of what slavery was had nothing to do with identity politics at the time. There was a belief system and a rationality to change that. Now, Ms. DiAngelo again made the reference again to also Title IX and the issue of same-sex marriage and the women's suffrage movement. Again, with no understanding of these movements at all. Because if she did, she would recognize that these idea of women believing in women's suffrage was not so clear-cut. So I'm going to show you a nice video, a couple of minutes long, on this concept to be able to help you with this idea. This is Title IX. This is from her Women's Channel's Vanessa. She's quoting two people who are having an argument about the women's suffrage movement. And I'm going to say that this was, I don't know where her credentials are because she doesn't go through it, but she's quoting Karen Strawn, who, if you saw the movie The Red Pill, she is one of the anti-feminists who has a pretty good record of understanding somewhat of history. And Garrett is actually a liberal person, also who's explaining it from the other side. And anytime you deal with an argument, you do want to hear both sides. But what I like what Vanessa tried to do is try to explain what everybody's talking about here, as well as the historical framework, because it's very important to understand that. So I'm starting in the middle here, because this is what I wanted to get to be able to show the issue that what's missing in this book about history and about understanding of our society.
For example, in November of 1895, Massachusetts did decide to conduct a non-binding referendum, or what some called a mock referendum, on the question of women's suffrage. Now, this was just in Massachusetts, and voter turnout was very low. Of the 612,000 women eligible to vote, only 42,676 actually registered to vote, and only 23,065 actually showed up to vote. Of the women that did vote, 861 voted against women's suffrage, and 22,204 voted for it. This is also slightly complicated, though, by the fact that anti-suffragists in Massachusetts at the time discouraged women from voting in the referendum because they were against voting. So it's hard to know how many of the non-voters were against women's suffrage or just indifferent to it.
So this is a very important point, that the nature of women at that time who got to vote on whether or not they wanted to vote. There were 600,000 women eligible to vote, 42,000 registered to vote, of which a little bit of half voted for it, which tells you that either they didn't want it or they didn't care. This is very important because when you're making an argument for something and understanding the historical context, you have to understand it from the point of view of the people at the time.
As Sarah Hunter Graham noted, the 1895 referendum did cast a long shadow on the suffrage movement, because although suffrage won in that vote, turnout was very low and indicated female apathy. What is less ambiguous, though, was the male vote in that referendum. Opposition to women's suffrage was 186,976 of the votes cast, almost 70% of the male voters being opposed to women's suffrage. Now, in the case of Britain, there was no referendum, but anti-suffragists attempted to organize their own polls on public opinion. They would poll different municipalities, and anti-suffrage canvassers would conduct these unofficial ballots or sometimes these prepaid postcard ballots, which is what I imagine Karen Strawn is referring to in some form when she talks about the postcard poll. Now, in these polls, votes in opposition to suffrage did generally outnumber supporters of women's suffrage, but there are a lot of potential problems with the way these polls were conducted, including the fact that when suffragists polled some of these same areas, they came out with more votes in favor of suffrage.
Yes, so way before the 2016 election, there were problems with the way that polls were conducted. That we find out. And what's going on here is that the anti-suffrage movement, which was against the idea of women voting, at that point seemed to have a stronger message and mindset than the people that wanted to vote, which is not uncanny. I mean, it's not unusual, because again, understanding the roles at that time in history of what people thought was important, it's important to understand what their mindset and what they were looking for and why they wanted what they wanted.
So this leads to the larger point that Julia Bush makes in her book. Both suffragists and anti-suffragists claimed to represent the quote-unquote ordinary woman during their campaigns. The ordinary woman was mostly a political and media invention and a conveniently malleable and overgeneralized construct.
I love this, and if you're going to take one thing from this video, this would be it. That the woman at that time period, and saying you're representing women, was a construct that wasn't based upon reality. That women were not a monolithic group that all believed one thing. And this is the problem in the entire aspect of the problem with white fragility. It creates a false identity that all people are this monolithic thing, which is not true. That's the big issue, so I want you to keep that in mind.
Meant to encompass the silent majority of women, including working class and poor women, who made up the bulk of the female population. So while the support of the ordinary woman was something that both sides wanted to claim, it was in fact incredibly difficult to prove.
If you have data showing the opinions of British women towards getting the vote, if you have that kind of data, Karen, I'd love to see it. What I think is going on here is what is known as presentism, also called the fallacy of nunc pro tunc. Then, as now, it means putting elements of the present world into the past in a false way when talking about the past. In the case of both Janet and Karen, they are doing this with polling. Now, I just wanted to point to a couple of things in what Karen said.
And men were literally saying, there were men in British Parliament saying, I've never seen a situation where not only was it being demanded of me to give a right to a population that's completely indifferent to it, but demanded to give a right to a population that is, in the most part, in the vast majority, virulently oppositional to it. They don't want it. They've said they don't want it. They refuse to am I going to force it on them? Right?
No, not right. See how she goes from 51% supporting suffrage just before it was passed to now saying that women were, at some point before that, I guess, completely indifferent to getting the vote? She's actually saying that they weren't just completely indifferent to it, but that the vast majority of women were virulently opposed to it. Then she says that they've said they don't want it. Now, there are writings by women in this period who were definitely against women getting the right to vote. And even though there isn't enough data to say conclusively how many women were for it and how many were against it, we can draw some conclusions, and I can demonstrate...
Garrett falls into his exact aspect of presentism when he says we can draw some conclusions, because you actually can't. You can state why you believe what you believe, but what is going on in that time period, if you were around at that time period, you would have a much better chance of at least knowing in your area what people believed. But even that would be much more difficult to do based upon the nature of society, the lack of newspapers and people being well read, and there's no media like there is today. So when Garrett says we can draw conclusions based upon that, he's falling into the same exact logical fallacy that he told about Karen falling into, which is presentism. And by the way, what happens in here as well.
That Karen is talking in a very reductionist way. Let's look at these two claims. Firstly, the idea that women were completely indifferent to getting the vote. And let's be charitable and assume she didn't mean all women, just most women. There were definitely women indifferent to the whole thing. But by the early 1910s, it had become the kind of issue that most people in society have an opinion about, like, say, Brexit today.
So most people, like Brexit, first of all, didn't have an opinion to begin with, but now they have a huge opinion. And again, that's a fallacy of presentism. Because again, he's not recognizing where the women were in that society. Because this issue wasn't like Brexit today. But we'll get to that in a second.
Secondly, we have the vast majority being virulently against it part. This can be debunked pretty easily just by looking at the level of anti-suffrage activism being undertaken by women. There wasn't much, and it wasn't particularly organized. If the vast majority of women had been so against female suffrage, you'd think you'd see more women engaged in anti-suffrage activity than...
By this logic, the nature and the ideology of Black Lives Matter is about 90% approval rating in the United States, because they are so much more vigilant and they're so much more vocal than any sort of counter-protest. So therefore, basically, that's the logical fallacy he's making here. People are much more likely to be up in arms or to protest or to make noise about a change that they want, much more than they're ever about keeping the status quo. People don't fight for the status quo, and that's a mistake he's making here.
Pro-suffrage activity, which was not the case. Quite the opposite, and that's not surprising.
Okay, so first I would just suggest to Garrett, if he's interested, to check out these scholarly books I mentioned, as it will give a lot of information on the development of the anti-suffrage movements over the years and the level of support they received over time. And this does vary across countries and even within different cities and counties. In the spirit of Garrett's reminder to Karen about the problem of presentism in understanding the past, it's also important that we apply this to our understanding of the anti-suffrage movement and how we tend to think about activism. The anti-suffrage movement had their seeds all the way back nearly as early as the suffrage movement did, but they didn't become as publicly vocal about their opposition until later in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This is in part because the very philosophy their movement was built on was this belief in the preservation of the two spheres of divided gender roles, which meant that women's feminine domain was in the domestic sphere and men's masculine domain was in the political public sphere. So their suffrage activism was less publicly visible in the beginning because they didn't want to adopt the public methods and tactics that the suffragists did in order to gain support. This was because their whole point was about not entering that realm. So they often confined themselves to personal appearances in legislative halls, or distributing literature to libraries, or newspapers, or magazine editors, or also influencing views through their upper-class connections. Now this did change later, especially moving into the early 20th century, because the antis realized that they just couldn't properly counter the suffragists' claims unless they took up more public roles and started debating suffragists. Now if you look at the New York Anti-Suffrage League as one example, they became very organized and they followed the suffragists around everywhere, debating them in public forums, in Parliament whenever a referendum was being proposed, and they distributed their own propaganda and wrote articles, etc., etc.
Until right now, did you know there was an anti-suffrage movement? Would you even have been taught this in school? Did anybody ever go through this with you? Because the nature is that most people do not know these things or are not taught these things. And what ends up happening is people don't recognize these things. And why is that the case? Is because we're not really taught these things in our schools, in our society. What we're taught is basically a watered down
This week
version,
is the 40...
a watered version down of about society and about how things function and work. So what I wanted you to understand more than anything else here, that when Robin DiAngelo talks about her white fragility and about the suffrage movement, about how they were and how identity politics played a role, it's actually not true. There was a split in the identity politics of the time period, that people had different points of view and different opinions. It wasn't monolithic. And there's reasons why things moved the way that they did. And this is why it's important to understand history, because otherwise what you do is you just keep playing a game and change it the way that you like. She also mentioned about the idea of Title IX and how wonderful that's been and what it's not led to. It's led to a lot of issues that have taken place in college campuses and an unfairness to people because it presumes the idea that everybody's the same and everybody should have equal outcome. You'll say, well, what's the problem with equal outcome? Isn't that a great thing? Well, let's take a look at that because she mentions Title IX at this point. So let's take a look at Title IX and see what happened with it.
Title IX was signed into law by President Richard Nixon on June 23, 1972. In 37 momentous words, it outlawed gender discrimination in all publicly supported educational programs. Now, before its passage, many of the nation's leading universities didn't accept women. Law schools, medical schools, they often used quotas to limit female enrollment. As for sports, female student athletes were rare and received precious little support from college athletic programs. The logic behind Title IX is the same as that behind all great civil rights legislation. In our democracy, the government may not play favorites among races or religions or between the sexes. We're all equal before the law, including in public universities and colleges. Well, today, there are many formidable female athletes, and the progress of women's sports should be celebrated. But something went wrong in the law's implementation. Because of pressure from women's groups like the National Women's Law Center and the Women's Sports Foundation, Title IX evolved into a rigid quota regime that dictates equal participation in sports by both sexes, regardless of interest.
I wonder if Title IX should apply to everybody's, how many people graduate from law school and medical school, and how many people graduate from nursing school, and how many people that graduate from education degrees for teaching, because we don't work this way for any other field, where we look at it from the standpoint of keeping it the percentage of how many people are there. Imagine the NBA under Title IX. So that mean that you would have to have the same racial makeup on every team as your population, or even if you did it on the population of the United States. That means 13% of the NBA would be African American. Well, 6% would be African American males, and 7% would be African American females, if you did it with that. But if you're supposing you take away gender from it. So at that particular time, you'd still have much less African Americans in the National Football League, in baseball, and in the NBA. Now, would that make sense?
Now, women's groups will deny that Title IX requires quotas, but it does. Schools are cutting back on male teams and creating new women's teams, not because of demand, but because they are afraid of a federal investigation. The goal in college athletics is called proportional representation. What that means is that if a school has 60% females, then it should have 60% female athletes. I mean, look what happened at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Howard's student body is 67% female, but women are only 44% of its athletes. So in 2007, the Women's Sports Foundation, this powerful Title IX advocacy group, gave Howard the grade F because of its 23% proportionality gap. Howard has already, at that time, had cut men's baseball, wrestling, and added women's bowling. But that just didn't narrow the gap. Unless it cuts about half of its current male athletes, it's going to remain under a Title IX cloud and legally vulnerable. Now, Howard's wrestling coach, Wade Hughes, summed up the problem this way, quote, "The impact of Title IX's proportionality standard has been disastrous because far more males than females are seeking to take part in athletics." No, say the Title IX advocates, women are every bit as committed to sports as men, and they have persuaded courts that if there are fewer women than men on college varsity teams, the only explanation is discrimination. The factual feminist is concerned because the evidence that women, taken as a group, are less interested in competitive sports than men is overwhelming. To give just one example. In 2012, a group of psychologists carefully analyzed men and women's propensity for competitive sports by studying, for example, who plays intramural sports. These are recreational games that college students can play just for the love of the game. Their finding? Only 1 in 4, about 26% of intramural participants are women. They also studied recreational activity in 41 public parks in 4 different states. Now, lots of women were exercising, but among those playing competitive team sports, only 10% were women. I am aware of no serious research that finds similar levels of interest between men and women in competitive sports. Let's be honest. There is a fallacy in the proportionality requirement. Title IX was meant to be an equal opportunity law, not a rigid quota system.
This is the problem when you ever look at anything from the standpoint of equal outcomes as opposed to equal opportunity.
It was meant to open doors for aspiring female athletes, but because of the relentless pressure from activist groups, it ended up slamming doors to keep men out, and athletic directors have to move heaven and earth to get enough women on their teams. Meanwhile, Title IX quotas have all but decimated men's wrestling, swimming, gymnastics, diving. Now, these sports and others are going extinct across the college campus for men. As one wrestling official put it, our sport survived the fall of Rome only to be conquered by Title IX. I'm going to end by asking a direct question to the Women's Sports Foundation. Your group gave Howard University an F because of its sports profile doesn't match its enrollments. There are 33% men, 67% women at Howard, yet women are only 44% of its teams. Well, nationally, women earn 58% of bachelor's degrees. Why doesn't the diminishing number of men on the college campus create a Title IX concern? The factual feminist gives the Women's Sports Foundation an F for basic fairness and common sense.
So she ends her video, which I thought was brilliant, by the way, on the note that why don't we look at proportionality at who's in the college? That the nature of who's there should make a difference about who's on the campus. So let's continue again. Take women's suffrage. If being a woman denies you your right to vote, you ipso facto cannot grant it to yourself, and you certainly cannot vote for your right to vote. Again, going back to the video we just did before, women did get the vote on the right to vote. In actuality, they were looked and polled and actually asked again and again. So the nature that women couldn't vote for their right to vote is actually historically, factually inaccurate. It would have been great if 600,000 women registered to vote and all of them voted yes, which would have blasted away that referendum totally, and they would have gotten it in Massachusetts much earlier. But again, let's not history get in the way of somebody's rewriting of history. If men control all the mechanisms that exclude women from voting, as well as the mechanisms that can reserve that exclusion, women must call on men for justice. You cannot have a conversation about women's rights to vote and men's need to grant it without naming women and men. Not naming that group to face the barriers only serves those who already have access. The assumption is the access enjoyed by the controlling group is universal. For example, although we are taught that women were granted suffrage in 1920, we ignore the facts that it was white women who received full access and that it was white men who granted it. Not until the 1960s through the Voting Rights Act were all women, regardless of race, granted full access to suffrage. Naming who has access and who doesn't guide our effort in challenging injustice. And like I said in the first video, if you saw it, and if you didn't, go back and watch it, that was also factually inaccurate. African American women not only were able to vote, that they were able to hold office at certain points at that point. This book is unapologetically rooted in identity politics. I am white. I'm addressing a common white dynamic. I'm mainly writing to a white audience where I use the terms us and we. I am referring to the white collective. For those of you who watch Star Trek, we are Borg. For those of you who do not understand the reference, the Borg were a collective species, sort of that worked on a hive mind. That the nature of the Borg were that everybody was interconnected with each other, and that all the things the Borg did were basically of one mindset. And she here is going ahead and talking about the white collective, as if it's a Borg mindset, that we're all on the same page and we all believe the same things because we are Borg. The only problem is it's untrue. It's untrue throughout history. White people don't agree on much. Black people don't agree on much. Families don't agree on much. Go to Thanksgiving and hear about the arguments at the table. Go to a Christmas dinner and hear people fight over politics, religion, sex. It don't make a difference. There will be fights. The idea of that there's a we and an us is a total denial of reality. It's not how we function. And when I say we don't function that way, in the sense that we are unlike each other, not like each other, as this book tries to create. The usage may be jarring to white readers because we are so really asked to think of ourselves as fellow whites in racial terms. No, I don't think the reason why this is jarring because it makes people think of white people in racial terms. I think it is jarring because it makes human beings think like they're bees or ants, working in a collective that somehow work in a system that they are not recognizing themselves. But rather they retreat in the face of that discomfort, we can practice building our stamina for critical examination of white identity, a necessary antidote to white fragility. I don't see this as an antidote to white fragility. What I see this for is a calling card for white supremacy. Basically, if you take the first paragraph, Robin DiAngelo is saying that white people only have the power to grant the rights to everybody else, as she utilizes the analogy of men only giving the right to women. Therefore, all minorities only get their rights from whites, which is why I had cognitive dissonance there. I hope you caught it. And the nature is that white people then grant the rights to everybody else, which basically is what white supremacists believe. That they are supreme. They are supremely powerful. That they have the ability, because of their white skin, to have this God-given right. I don't believe that for a moment, and I hope you don't either. Whether or not an individual group had more power based upon socioeconomics or what it's did in terms of society has nothing to do with its ability to sustain power. As you saw what happened to Nazi Germany and what's happening to the decline of the American system today. If we keep going the way we're going, soon it's going to be China fragility. So this idea of talking about white identity as giving people rights is because people of white skin have somehow have this ability to do this because of the nature of their skin is very scary, and this idea is very much a calling card for white supremacists. This raises another issue rooted in identity politics. In speaking as a white person to a primarily white audience, I'm yet again centering white people and the white voice. Yes, you are. As you go ahead and talk about this, you keep now elevating whiteness and again centering white people, which again is racist. I have not found a way around this dilemma. Wow! Yeah, I did. It's called individuality and not groupthink. Because you're exactly correct. The dilemma you're creating is exactly the reason why a white supremacist are going to read your book and use it as a calling card. I have not found a way around this dilemma. For as an insider, I can speak to the white experience in ways that may be hard to deny. No, you can't. Because your experience and my experience are not the same. Where I grew up and what you grew up is not the same. Who I was around, who people I know, friends, interactions, coworkers, and who you were around, your ideas, and your lack of history knowledge is not the same. So though I am centering the white voice, I am using my insider status to challenge racism. I'm one of the good ones. I'm challenging racism as those white people who have the power. Wow. To not use my position this way is to uphold racism, and that is unacceptable. I don't believe not only are you not taking and challenging racism, I think you're increasing it. It is both and that I must live with. I would never suggest that mine is the only voice that should be heard. I'm glad about that. That was what I edited, by the way. I would never suggest that mine is the only voice that should be heard. Only that is one of many pieces needed to solve the overall puzzle. And here I would disagree that nothing about this voice solves any of the puzzle. People who do not identify as white may also find this book helpful for understanding why it is so often difficult to talk to white people about race and racism. I don't find it difficult to talk about race or racism with anybody. I've done it for many, many years. I think the nature of racism is something we all can talk about because many of us have experienced racism in many different ways, both on receiving and basically hearing ends from people and challenging. So the idea that you can't talk about it because you yourself are a specific color is absolutely erroneous. People of color cannot avoid understanding white consciousness to some degree if they are to be successful in this society. I don't understand this idea about the idea of white consciousness to be successful in the society. Remember, we are living in a multiracial society. Hispanic people, people from India, China, Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. There are many people from many different countries here. There are many people from many different countries who have been incredibly successful here. I wonder why and how. Yet nothing in dominant culture affirms their understanding or validates their frustrations when they interact with white people. I hope this exploration affirms the cross-racial experiences of people of color and provides some useful insight. This book looks at the United States and the general context of the West, United States, Canada, and Europe. It does not address nuances and variations within other socio-political settings. However, those patterns have also been observed in white people in other white settler societies, such as Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. It's very convenient not to look at the rest of the world, because then it would challenge a lot of the ideas in this book. If you looked at how China functions, and Japan functions, and Pakistan functions, and India functions, and how their societies work, you're going to have a lot of difficulties with a lot of things in this book. Now, before I just challenge the last aspect of the problem with what is it wrong with identity politics, she goes about what about multiracial people. It's the last part of her author's note. And again, besides being incredibly offensive to anybody who is multiracial, and that, by the way, is defined as people either who are children of white and black people, or people that were adopted by cross-cultural. If you were a black person adopted by a white person, or a white person adopted by black people, that the nature of that might change the way that you see yourself and identity. But she says that doesn't make a difference. It makes a difference how society sees you. So the woman that I met in college who looked white to me, and then I said, when she told me she was black, which I thought originally was funny, but I absolutely accepted her definition in terms of what she was and what her parents were, according to Robin DiAngelo, because she could pass as white, you're a white girl. Sorry, tough on you. Your self-identity doesn't matter. And the truth is, from the aspect of receiving some sort of privilege, there's reality to that. People are going to treat her because they think that she is white, right? That they're going to think that she's that way. Imagine if you could use a cloak and that you'd be able to change the way you look. That's the old joke with Eddie Murphy on the old Saturday Night Live clips, where he would dress as the white person and everybody's starting, as the last black person left the bus, everybody's sitting there partying. He's like, oh, I didn't realize this stuff happened. And he's pretending to be a white person. It's done in humor. But the idea was to believe that white society was so much different when a black person wasn't there. And it was making fun of that idea. But the nature of this entire book goes into this idea and the problems with it. Now again, we didn't even get up to the introduction of the book. This is just the author's notes to start off her book. And I just recognize how many problems that we already uncovered, how many things she did with lack of history. But the last thing I want to leave with is by a real social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt. And I've quoted him before, and I probably will quote him again because he's a brilliant man. By the way, a liberal professor, very liberal. Okay, this is not a conservative mindset, somebody that's trying to change the bastion and trying to hold back into values. He's a liberal professor. And the reason why that's important is only so you can't just disregard what he says as his politics is on the right and therefore he's saying these things. He's looking at it purely from a social psychology point of view. So let's take a look at this.
In the United States right now, as many people have noticed, we are seeing a huge escalation of our long-running culture war. Unfortunately, universities are right in the heart of that. So the right, and especially right-wing media, love to show video clips of students saying outrageous things. They love to say the universities are bastions of political correctness. They've lost their minds. The left is motivated to say, no, there's not a problem. There's nothing going on. It's just that the right hates ideas. They hate universities. What Greg and I do in the book is we say, no, we're going to cut through the culture war. Let's just look at what's going on. Let's look at what a university should do. And so when we talk about identity politics, which is a controversial topic, we start by saying, of course you need identity politics. Identity politics is not a bad thing automatically. Politics can be based on any distinction. It can be based on any group interest. So for gay students or black students or women to organize, that's identity politics. That's perfectly legitimate. The question is, how are they organizing? What's the overarching framework?
So he first states out very simply the idea that you identify with a group and you have certain things to that group that you're interested in and that you politically want to see those issues addressed. Absolutely legitimate, and I absolutely agree. But that's not what we're talking about here. But we'll get to that in a second, okay? But that absolutely would agree.
And we've seen two versions of it in American history. You can do it the way most of the civil rights leaders did it, Martin Luther King in particular, where you draw a larger circle around the group, you emphasize what we have in common, and then you say some of our brothers and sisters are being denied equal access, equal opportunity, or equal dignity. That works. That has worked historically in much tougher times and zones.
That worked during the Abolitionist Movement, as I mentioned earlier, because the nature is people not all people, but a vast majority of people want to be on the side of doing something good or seeing themselves in the way of good. It's one of the reasons why that Robert DiAngelo in White Fragility is so much able to talk about people's vehemence against her is because people don't like to be called a racist. There's a reason why white supremacists aren't like a big group where people are going, I want to be a part of that group. There's a reason why people put them down. There's a reason why people put down Nazis. Nobody wants to be part of that group.
And that works and will work on college campuses. The other way you do it, which is growing on college campuses, is common enemy identity politics. It's based on the Bedouin notion, me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me, my brother and cousin against the stranger. It's a very general principle of social psychology. If you try to unite people, let's all unite against them. They're the bad people. They're the cause of the problems. Let's all stick together. That's a really dangerous thing to do in a multi-ethnic society, especially in a university where we're actually all trying to work together to solve the problem.
It makes it much, much worse when you bring it out into society and you start to, again, create the problem of you're the one creating the problem. And again, we're going to get to who she's blaming.
We have to work on our speech climate. In the business world, it's called speak-up culture. In the academic world, it's called just basic openness to ideas. When you put people together and you want them to talk, Of course, people have a lot of different goals and fears. Nobody wants to say something stupid. Nobody wants to say something that will get them into trouble. If you can create a really trusting environment in which we're all in this together, contribute your ideas. If someone says something and you think it's wrong, say so. That's going to lead to more innovation. That's going to lead to more progress. But what if you have an environment in which if I say something that offends anyone, they can report me anonymously to HR or some other entity? I'm going to think 3 times before I speak up. That's what we have on campus. In the bathrooms at my university, there are signs telling students how to report me anonymously if I say anything that offends them. So I don't feel free to speak up when I'm on campus. I can speak more openly off campus, but on campus, I have to watch myself. As one student said to a friend of mine, my motto is silence is safer. Just shut up and you won't get in trouble.
Think about how horrible that is for a sociology professor who has to deal with very difficult topics, talking about very difficult things, to a student population who might not like to hear it and can get very upset very quickly. How that must be and how you have to operate.
Now, this is a terrible speech climate. A university cannot function if people are defensive in this way. So in universities, in organizations that value innovation, we have to not just encourage people to speak, we have to assure them that they're not going to be shamed, humiliated, or punished for sharing an opinion in good faith. Look, we have a culture war raging all around us. It's very easy to take offense. People are understandably angry. Here within these walls, we have to put that aside. We have to trust each other. We have to give each other the benefit of the doubt. And it's going to be good for all of us to do that.
The sad part is we're already seeing the nature of that in our culture war in life in our societies now. We are seeing now more and more people have, I can't speak, people being fired for things they put on Facebook or things that they say. Now, people say stupid and foolish things. People say racist things. But the idea for us is to be able to point that out and educate. We are, in a sense, all in this together, to a certain degree. We are in a society that's together. The problem is that people can't talk to each other about ideas because they're so afraid of offending somebody or saying something to somebody. That's damaging. That's hurtful. The identity politics of keeping people quiet is hurtful and damaging to society at large. I hope and pray that we get past this and soon, because my biggest fear is that when you put people into identity politics, the other identity politics creeps up very quickly. And these are the things that bring about things that happened in Nazi Germany. Things that bring up the idea of people's pride in their identity, which is very problematic. Stay away from tribalism. It doesn't lead to good things. I hope that you like this video, and if you disagree with anything I said in the video, I'd love to hear you. If you haven't subscribed, please do, but more importantly, share this with people, specifically who have read the book or who think white fragility is a great idea and they learned so much from this book and it was so helpful to them. And of course, you always have the option of becoming a patron to this by going to the Subscribe-star link below. And I wish you a good night and good mental health.